everyone. My name is Reverend Dr. Katie O'Dunn. Please call me Katie. I'm super informal. I always like to start with Reverend so that folks know that people can, in fact, be ordained ministers and have a mental health condition and have OCD and really believe in evidence-based treatment. So I'm an ordained minister and interfaith chaplain with OCD. I spent a large chunk of my ministry very, very private about my own mental health journey and mental health struggles. If I go really far back when I was in my ordination process and when I was going through seminary, I was told by a mentor that I shouldn't seek treatment because no one would respect me in ministry or I wouldn't pass my psych evaluations. So I was already experiencing pretty challenging OCD at the time and really worked to push it down, didn't want anyone to know, actually studied how to get around it on my psych evaluations and looked like I was doing really well and got out of seminary, was ordained into the United Church of Christ and got my first big role as the academy chaplain at the biggest private school in the continental US. And I was 25, the first female in the role, and was serving 2,700 families from different faith backgrounds. Absolutely loved the role. I was teaching, doing trauma work and pastoral care and interfaith work, but simultaneously was hitting rock bottom with my OCD because I so desperately wanted to get it right. And I'll talk about some of that today, but OCD latches onto the things that are the most important to someone. So it latched onto my students, to my ministry, and to everything that I cared about. And ultimately, a big component of my story is I lost some students that I cared deeply about to overdose and to suicide. And my OCD latched on and blamed me very intensely. I felt like I could have stopped it or like it was my fault in some way, shape, or form. I hit rock bottom and ultimately had to seek treatment and did that in secret. And treatment saved my life. Exposure and response prevention for OCD absolutely saved my life, helped me to reclaim my life. And for the first time, I didn't want to be quiet about the fact that I was a minister who had this mental health experience and who had actually sought treatment while serving in ministry. So when I first started coming forward about my experience, I let a group of my high school students write an article about the chaplain with OCD who had sought treatment in secret. And when it came out, I thought I was going to get fired. I thought the president would be like, what is she doing? And it was the opposite. I started hearing from families that they wanted to have conversations about what it looked like to be in mental health spaces and faith spaces at the same time. They wanted to know how they could talk to their priest, to their rabbi, to their imam about this journey. And ultimately, it led me to leaving what I really loved in school chaplaincy to do work around faith and OCD full time. So I did my Doctor of Ministry in Integrative Chaplaincy with a focus on reimagining evidence-based treatments for OCD as spiritual practices. And now I run a large app and virtual community called Stick with the Ick, where we train clinicians in interfaith literacy for treatment. We train clergy in understanding mental health, and we support folks across faith traditions navigating faith, OCD, and often religious trauma, which is a piece we'll talk about today too. So passionate about this work on a personal and professional level, and just honored to be here with these awesome humans to share today.
Yeah, I'm so grateful. I'm grateful to have Reverend Katie and Allie here and to John for basically being the chaos coordinator for us. I'm Dr. Stacy Greeter. I'm a child, adolescent, and adult psychiatrist down here in Sarasota, Florida. And I've been extremely privileged to start having a learning relationship with Samaritan Counseling Center, which offers faith-based therapy. So my background, I am Jewish and agnostic, and I grew up in a community that had a fair amount of anti-Semitism, and to this day, seeing a crucifix, lights up my amygdala with some fear. So I found my psychiatry journey and my relationship with a lot of Christian faith-based therapists at Samaritan, to be not just healing for my patients, but I think healing for me as well. As I really, and so I wanted to do this in particular because I'm hoping we can inspire more joining together of people from so many different faiths, backgrounds, and cultures to see all the nuances in the interplay between religion and mental health treatment. It's massive power for healing, for harm, to bring people together, to drive people apart. And so I really appreciate people participating in this experiment of mine, for us just to, I'm hoping we can just have more open, direct conversations about how the great power of religion can be harnessed more for good and for bringing people together. So thank you. And side note, before we continue, I'll put my email in the chat. I am looking for as much representation as possible. And if people know some Muslim mental health professionals or leaders or more rabbis who want to get involved, I really, please have them email me. Thanks.
Thank you. I am, as we go through the questions, sorry, I feel like I'm talking to two audiences. Anyway,
Okay.
as we go through the questions, I will put them in the chat for those of you on the screen, just so you can see, you actually see the question. And we have 8 questions scheduled. Of course, we'll see, time-wise how that goes. But so I want to go ahead and throw the first question out, and we'll start from there. So the first question, which, by the way, I don't think we even said what the presentation title is. So let me state that, so that's clear to everybody. Engaging religious populations in mental health treatment, spiritually motivated mental health stigma. That is the big topic for the day.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, we haven't mentioned this either. We have 3 more presentations. This is one of 4. So I'll get that information out to you. The next one is, they're once a month. So I believe the next one is February 13th. But we'll get that information out to you as we're getting that together. So our first question, what are some of the most common forms of spiritually based mental health stigma you encounter in your clinical practice, and how do you approach it?
I could start if you like, John.
Yes.
Yeah. So I should probably have to take the first bite since I wrote the question. So it's my fault these questions that Ellie and Reverend Katie have to answer, right? And I think that even before I answer it, I might note that there is some justification for religious communities' stigma against psychiatry. In our history, Freud asserted that religiousness is a childlike, more primitive way of being that people just use to defend against a fear of death or to defend against their more primitive instincts. And that, like, if you were fully psychoanalyzed, you wouldn't have a need for religion. So some bad blood goes back in time. And also, as mental health professionals, we have valid reasons for having some fear in working with religious communities. I often come across people who believe that a psychiatric illness represents a spiritual or moral failing, and that taking medication, which is something that I offer to people, represents a turning away from their God, turning away from their faith. And it can set us up to be on opposite sides, it seems, at first in the clinical encounter. So I think that, how do I approach it? Well, I think really, James Griffith talks about whole person relatedness, finding a human connection outside the labels that put people as insiders or outsiders. I think recognizing that when a patient really fears uh, that it's what purpose is this serving for your patient when they're putting up these barriers? Ostensibly, when a patient says, oh, you're just saying that because you're Jewish, or you're just saying that because you're a shrink, or you're just da da da, right? Ostensibly, it's like, oh man, my patient doesn't like me. But if we take a step back, it's recognizing there's a person who is scared of being rejected, of being judged by a mental health professional for having a certain belief. A person who may be afraid of being judged by their religious community. And that is not about us, it's that person trying to protect themselves. And how do we meet them by fully being curious and seeing where they're coming from? So, how are you handling that in your work, Reverend Katie?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Stacy. And thank you for just raising the level of curiosity with folks. And I think for validating the experiences and the way that folks feel on different sides, because I think, yeah, there have been challenges throughout history between mental health providers and spiritual providers. And gosh, validating fears and experiences for folks that we work with, I think is so important. I think the biggest kind of stigmas that I encounter are around folks either believing or often being told that their mental health struggles are actually a spiritual failing. And it breaks my heart when I hear this, because a lot of times it also leads folks to feeling shame about seeking treatment. And then also feeling shame within their faith community. It's like they feel like they're doing something wrong on two fronts. It's one, well, I can't seek treatment because then I'm not having enough faith that God is going to take away my illness. And simultaneously, it's, well, why hasn't God taken this away at this point? Why is this still here? Why, I'm trying so hard. So a lot of times I'll work with folks both on the spiritual and the mental health side around this to help folks recognize that, one, mental health concerns are absolutely not a spiritual failing, but that mental health practitioners and spiritual practitioners can actually work together. I try to do a big reframe to let someone know that it is so absolutely valid to be frustrated with having, I work primarily with OCD, so I'll say OCD for a long time and having this really difficult experience. I always say spiritually, I don't necessarily try to explain it or to give a why around that. But what I do say is that maybe we can look at the answer to prayer in a different way. And perhaps an answer to prayer actually can be evidence-based treatment. And the fact that we have treatments that are so incredibly effective for disorders like OCD. And what a beautiful answer to prayer that we actually can step toward this big, beautiful, awesome life that God has given us by engaging in treatment and getting better. And that these two things don't have to be separate. And again, just because you're struggling, it is not a spiritual feeling. It is you being human, and you seeking treatment can actually be a reflection of your faith.
I've also heard a question asked, how might God possibly be working through your doctors, your mental health professionals? Is there any space? Is there any space for your God in this work?
Yeah. And it's 10,000% my favorite thing. Long before school chaplaincy and now mental health chaplaincy, my early training was in hospice chaplaincy and palliative care. And I worked with a lot of end-of-life issues, and I did some surgery work there as well with some challenging illnesses. And our primary prayer with folks would be also praying for the way that the divine was working with their doctors and their nurses and their care providers, and guiding their hands in that work. And that is such an answer to prayer too. It's not just a snap, this illness is taken away, or this, it's so much more than that.
I'd say another kind of unique layer when it comes to treatment and stigma and religious communities is some of the challenges that come up when someone is just seeking care to begin with and where they're going to go, what is considered treatment that maybe they consider like that aligns with their faith versus not. I know for myself, as someone who had OCD and needed evidence, very, specific evidence-based treatment, and in the midst of, being in an evangelical community, there were only a small handful of clinicians that I would trust because I needed to know that they were also part of the evangelical, group that I was a part of, and that they understood all these areas of my life. And if I was going to hand them basically what felt like the keys to my life and giving me guidance, they needed to understand on like not just like a logical level, but like truly understand what it meant to be a Christian for me. I don't think that's a bad thing to look for by any means, but what I've seen as a challenge is that sometimes that will get in the way from people who have specific diagnoses that need specialized care, that maybe there's not someone who meets this very specific niche of, yes, they take United and they're Christian and they treat OCD. Oh, I need to see them in person also on Thursdays after 4, right? Um, and that's a challenge that I come into time and time again is, okay, yes, this is an important part of your life. Just curious, what would come up for you with the idea of seeing a provider who doesn't identify as Christian? I would imagine for a lot of folks, at least for myself, there would have been a absolutely not response. And that sometimes that lack of flexibility with that perhaps can lead to sometimes lags in getting evidence-based care that is going to get people, the quality of life that they're looking for because of the diagnosis they have. Again, I think if there is a person in that happens to be available after 4, takes United, is Christian, great. I'll add them to my list. I always say that. I'm building up but I think that's where it becomes a barrier, right? Of like, we need to focus on, you are seeking treatment. Would you say, I need a root canal, but no, I won't see the person that's available because they come from from a different faith background? No, I don't. Well, maybe there's people out there, but typically that's not like a screening question. But for mental health, absolutely. Is it an asset when people come from a wide variety of lived experiences and backgrounds? Yes. I think a question that we'll go into later is when people say, oh, I want someone that comes from this background, what does it actually mean to integrate faith into mental health practices? That's a whole other question that can mean a huge amount of different things. But I think that stigma of, I will not be willing to see someone who doesn't fit this background and gets it, can sometimes be a barrier in people getting the treatment that they desperately need. So,
And fascinatingly, when people assume sameness, like same beliefs in a relationship, there's more, it's less therapeutically effective than when people come into the relationship assuming difference with curiosity.
And I'm so glad Stacy said that, because I know we talked about this in some of our prep calls for this too. And everyone is always really surprised when I say, oh, I'm a minister and a chaplain and I work with mental health. And I do not tell people that they have to see individuals who share their faith background at all. It has to be individuals who are well versed and who know evidence-based treatments in that particular disorder and are open to learning about and respecting their faith practices. Because because 2 individuals are Christian or Jewish or Muslim does not mean that they share those same practices. And I'm also a huge advocate for chaplains or spiritual care providers being able to come in for the conversation. You can have a whole awesome team supporting this person. And I always tell folks, get the best OCD provider that you can in your area, because it's an OCD issue, not a faith issue. We can have faith supported alongside that.
So I want to lead us into our next question because y'all are sort of circling around it a little bit,
Okay.
actually. And it has to do with dealing with rigid individual clients. And so here's the question. What strategies do you use to plant the seeds of spiritual growth or maturity in a rigid and defensive individual?
Yeah.
As a clinician.
So I think believe validating their perspective and truth first. And it's almost like this is what we do no matter who we're working with as a mental health professional. We're like, how can I get people flexibility, agency, and self-reflection going, and their inner curiosity going. Right? So it's at the core. And that's why I think, I mean, unfortunately, some mental health professionals out here, they'll just be like, oh, well, I'm just gonna not work with that, spiritually rigid person, whatever, right? Like, what is it? Okay. And I think that you miss out because I think we really grow a lot as mental health professionals when we are constantly exposed to different perspectives. And there's a bi-directional growth that happens between me enhancing my flexibility and curiosity as I'm able to enhance other people's flexibility, curiosity. So major side benefits. So I'd say, instead, don't tell people, but be curious and sort of like a little verbal highlighter. I saw a patient today, and I was asking them about they talked about how the Christian community is important to them, and they came out with, well, it's important for me to hang out, to be with other Christian girls because they're more pure, and I'm like, okay, and I just let that sit there, right? I'm hearing what Griffith refers to as the sociobiological purpose of religion, to define who is in the in group and who is okay and who is in the out group and who gets judged. So I don't jump at that. I let it. I'm like, okay, all right, pinning it for maybe later, and they come out and I'm asking, okay, so yeah, how does God work in your life, and show up in your life, and they're like, okay, well, when this relationship doesn't work out, then I know that God didn't mean for it to work out. And I'm hearing like, okay, maybe there's some healthy aspects and unhealthy aspects there. Like there's, how do I shift that? Because there's some, sort of spiritual bypass of, it's for God to like make my relationship work out. And I'm asking them, I'm like, so I'm asking, and what do you think God hopes for you to learn from those experiences, and what direction He wants you to grow in, and then I'm getting more stuff where there's an internal locus of control and some opportunity for taking some ownership, and so it's sort of like a little dance where you're a verbal highlighter and you're hearing some help and you're hearing some potential, and you're chasing it like a little thread is how I almost see it. But yeah, what do you guys think?
Go ahead, Allie.
Gonna say, as someone that mostly, specializes in working with neurodivergent youth with OCD, parents, and especially, those who come from maybe high control religious backgrounds, I'd say my favorite patients are the ones who are about as flexible as a steel rod covered in concrete. And that's just kind of the crowd, that, especially in the OCD world. They are not known for flexibility. And I appreciate that as a person with OCD and ADHD myself. I can resonate with that. And I think that's also where that curiosity piece is absolutely a huge one. I mean, if you are, trying to tell someone I would not suggest telling one of those kids that they're wrong. It won't go well. It's just simply for anyone involved, and you won't win. But what
Especially with OCD will always find a way to win that, right? Like it's always going to find a hole in whatever your theological argument is. Like they've got you.
They've already done the work. They've already got the notes, and they will point to it. And they'll give you the references to it. It's impressive, and you will never win. With that being said, I think that there's also a lot of opportunities that patients, especially youth, are just longing to be asked, longing to be understood, to be asked, without it being clear that like the goal without it being like the goal is to change your mind, and they can sense that nearly instantly. So I think there's this question of like being curious, but then also I love looking at kind of like the outcomes, or as with using the religious verbiage, like the fruits of these labors, right? I think especially in the world of OCD, and Katie, you'll be able to attest to this a lot of working with folks who have religious scrupulosity, who are like, yes, I need to pray for 5 consecutive hours, this and that. I can note this, look at this thing I, have indicated, this is why. Um, and I'm not going to argue about the reasoning process. In the world of OCD, that's never a good choice. But sometimes what I'll point to and what I really hone in on with these conversations is the values piece, right? Okay, like yes, you are engaging in 5 consecutive hours of prayer. I am hearing your mental process of how you've landed there, the reasoning. I can get there with what you've said. Would I choose, would I choose that myself? No, but with what you've explained, your process, that makes sense. And what's the result, right? In your faith system, what does it mean to live a life filled with faith? Does it mean that, are you feeling trapped? Are you feeling like restricted? Are you feeling under control? Or are you feeling like, what would it look like? Would it mean freedom? What does that feel like and look like for you? Would it look like connection? Are you getting enough of that right now? And if someone who has severe OCD, the answer is going to be no, right? It's going to be, I'm doing all these things because what if? Because this is what I should do. This is the right thing to do, the responsible thing to do. And I'm not going to argue with that process, but rather, and tell me how you're feeling. Tell me as far as like what the results, the fruits. Great. I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong. I'm saying, how can we really create, a life that gives you what your faith is all about, right? Those are very important values. And also, I think we've talked about this before that, there's so much verbiage in the clinical world that translates nearly perfectly to to verbiage that's used in the religious realms, right? Like, what's the difference between, values? Like, values is just kind of like an across the board word, but there's other things too, right? What does it mean to engage in like reflective prayer, and like how can we layer that with mindfulness, right? Sometimes I think people think they have to choose. They have to choose their religious practices or spiritual or clinical interventions. And almost more often than not, they greatly overlap. Do you have to change the verbiage sometimes? Yes. And that actually makes it a lot more safe to folks, right? If I'm not doing this thing that's being prescribed to me by a clinician that doesn't, in fact, this aligns so perfectly, I just need to shift maybe how I'm going into this, right? So that's kind of some of the initial thoughts of working with, rigid folks who are like, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, and this is how I have to get there. It's like, okay, let's look at the journey, and where things are getting clunky or where they're not feeling like freedom for you.
And I love that Allie brought up the values piece. I think that is such an important thing as we start to, again, and I actually love how this question is phrased because it's planting seeds. It's not saying, oh, you're really rigid in this area. It's asking questions. And one of the things I always have folks do when I'm working on religious scrupulosity cases is list out, what am I doing that is bringing me meaning and peace and connection and joy versus what am I doing from a space of anxiety and guilt and fear and shame and urgency, and just being able to have them start to point those things out. Not that it's right or that it's wrong, but just to start to be able to recognize what are the things that we're doing that are actually bringing us closer to the divine. And through an ACT lens as well, I love thinking about, we always talk about cognitive flexibility within the mental health world. And I love that theological flexibility can also be a conversation too. And I love the book ACT for Clergy and Pastoral Counselors that talks about this a lot. And the fact that theological flexibility isn't about abandoning your beliefs or no longer caring about those things. It's about maintaining really a connection to your core values and also allowing space for questions and uncertainties and evolving perspectives. And I always let folks know that even as a minister, that's been a part of my experience, that when I first went to seminary, I thought there'd be a big flashing sign that would give me every single one of the answers and I would know all of the things. And then I walked out with a lot more questions, and that actually can be a part of our evolving faith.
to say that's also just like an ongoing, especially in the world of OCD, for folks
Yes.
that are familiar with OCD treatments. Like OCD is, I would also describe as like clinically significant intolerance of uncertainty, right? And you think of, I will all the time, especially with folks who have that background, go back to the definition of faith. Like, what does faith mean to you? How would you define it? And for a group of folks who are always looking for absolute certainty, I'm like, well, would there be, I mean, the question is always, would there even be room for faith if you had absolute certainty? No, that's a definition, right? Is like living in the midst of uncertainty with hope. And that's exactly what we're working with in ERP treatment for OCD. So there's so much parallel, which I'm like, Katie, that's all the work you do as well. It's like, yes, it can be a spiritual practice. And I think that's exactly where people, are terrified, as they should be, if they feel like a clinician is going to tell them to abandon their faith, if they need to get rid of their religious practices, that they're wrong. If that's the message they're getting from their clinician, that's not a good clinician, right? Instead, it's like, oh, great, we don't want to take you away from this. We want to push you towards those values and the things that you love so much, because actually there's a lot of overlap between those things likely that you love about your your practices and what we're trying to hone in on in therapy.
And I always like, I mean, and I know we'll get into this later, so I'll just say this one thing and then but I think, Allie, what you're saying, it reminds me, I always tell folks more working together, we are absolutely trying to get you closer to your faith. And we're actually trying to, and I'm always cautious with who I say this to initially, but I really believe this with OCD. A lot of times with OCD, folks end up actually worshiping OCD and not actually connecting with God in a way that's meaningful to them. All of the compulsions and rituals that they're doing really are kind of worshiping OCD. So going through treatment, it's not about no longer connecting with God. It's actually about stopping our worship of OCD so that we can connect with the divine in a beautiful way that's authentic to you and your customs and your practices.
I want to use Allie's reference to values to take us to our next question, because that's brought up in this next question. How do you handle your countertransference when you strongly disagree with a client's religious values?
So my first answer is good therapy and self-reflection for yourself. But I think first ask, how does this belief or behavior really make sense in their world, to be able to understand it? And because there's often a certain belief, value is serving a really important purpose in their life.
Yeah, this is hard. And I was thinking about a lot of cases, and I think it's really interesting. So most of my work has been in the interfaith realm, and I love actually working with people who believe very differently from how I believe. What I tend to struggle with is sometimes with rigidity of belief. Eh, when I'm working with folks that they aren't necessarily open to other traditions or to other humans because of the things that they've been taught. And I really sometimes struggle with that and have to kind of watch myself in terms of how I'm responding and recognize and do a lot of internal work on, where am I coming from? What's a value for me? I don't need to impose a value for me onto them. I need to help them figure out actually what's value driven for them, as a part of their tradition. And there was a case I was working on recently where it was actually really challenging because the parents who initially reached out to me to actually work with their child, we were actually very aligned in terms of denomination and the way that we viewed scripture. And the child, not for reasons of OCD, but actually because of what was value driven for them, actually sees scripture in a much more rigid way, and sees the world and sees other faith traditions in a more rigid way. And in analyzing, I realized that really wasn't reflective of OCD. It was just who they were. And having to have the conversation with the parents of, yeah, this might not align with your beliefs or my beliefs. And also, this is your child's authentic value. And how do we figure out the ways that we can honor that? I don't know if that makes sense, but it's a challenge. I know that can be really challenging. Yeah.
I think I'm always in this constant state of like case conceptualization. I think this actually similarly comes up the most with working with parents, right? And maybe I'll hear them say something that, of course, I'm going to have this initial visceral reaction to because of my own lived experiences, because of my own clinical background. And I'm constantly thinking through what is this lens through which they're saying this, right? Like if I was this parent and I believed that if X, Y, and Z happens, that my child is going to be, you know, eternally cut off from God, of course I would feel very strongly about these things. Whether or not I agree with that, that's a whole other conversation, a whole other kind of thing that I have to put in the box. But I think just being able to see through that lens to get an idea of what, like, where is this person landing with this, right? If they feel strongly about this, where is that coming from? Can I see through that lens and be able to figure out a way to like work with them respecting that, not arguing. Again, that never goes well. And no one wants to see a therapist that's going to argue with them and their beliefs, nor should they. But rather being able to see through that lens and be like, okay, here, let's pull those values from there. You really care about protecting your child. We might have different definitions of what that means. Great. Let's talk through collaboratively how we can get there, right? We all have the same goal of your child being happy, being healthy, being safe. Can I, pull from those values that you have to work collaboratively? I think also similar, people surprise me all the time where I'll have conversations with people who, tell me about their religious background, and I'll sometimes make this assumption that they feel a certain type of way about, certain religious communities, that either they want nothing to do with it or they care so much. And if you don't ask, you never know. And so they'll surprise me and be like, explain all these things of this is how you do this, you do that. And my assumption is like, oh, that must be really important to them. And then next session, they'll be like, oh, well, yeah, that's how you're supposed to do it, but I don't care. And I'm always like, oh, wow, well, we covered a lot of territory there. Or vice versa, right? Maybe they'll act, So I think just clarifying and not making assumptions. It's natural that we're going to make assumptions based on, and based on our own lived experience, even within the deconstruction realm. Me and Katie have talked about this, that I ran a group for the ISDF. We had a faith and OCD conference, and I ran the one for deconstruction and religious trauma. And within that group of people, the full spectrum, right, of people who are like, I want absolutely nothing to do with the church or religion, won't touch with a 10-foot pole, to like, this is my whole world. And they've all gone through these, traumatic experiences. So I think it's so important to ask, to clarify, to be curious, rather than just assume based on maybe some initial data that you've gotten, like, oh, I'll fill in the rest of the pieces, based on what I've gotten so far.
I'm going to take us to question 4, which somewhat references Allie's introduction and comments about not trusting, and how she, had those 5 things when she was trying to figure out who she was going to see or not see. So the question is, what do you do when your client wonders if they can really trust you because you don't share the same religious belief system as theirs?
Which I experience on a regular basis.
Part of daily, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard. And, it's funny because when I was discussing this, someone was like, oh, well, they could just go see a different psychiatrist. And they may not have a lot of options available to them, unfortunately. So I think I'm kind of putting a little plug in here for clinicians, of course, within your comfort level as a clinician, to be willing to work with some populations that initially say, hey, you're an outsider as my clinician. You're not one of me. You're not one of us. And I do that on a regular basis, and I do find it rewarding. There's a quote from, I don't remember which book. I think it was Griffith's book, Religion Not Healed, Religion Not Harmed, which I love. It says, discovery of differences in belief and worldview advance mutual respect more than discovery of shared commonalities. If we can fully embrace and respect the other person's differences. And so that's key. And so I think it's a great opportunity for them to explore really the importance of their faith, because it's going to be front and center, to explain to me like, hey, yeah, I kind of get away with like asking questions that maybe I wouldn't get away with otherwise. Like, I'm Jewish, I don't know, what do I know, right? So explain to me like why that's important and valuable to you and how you connect to God that way. Do tell me more about that, right? So I can come in, with this more naive and curious uh, attitude with these populations that can be really valuable. So, and really trying to connect with that person's personal spirituality. And Griffith talks about the sociobiology purpose of religion, which is for communities to take care of each other and survive, right? Like, who's in the group and who's out of the group, and there's a group of people who are going to keep you from starving. And then there's the other purpose of religion, the more personal spiritual purpose of meaning and connection and common humanity. And we're kind of like really highlighting that part of the material that the person is giving you, and honing in there. Also, like people talk about becoming an amygdala whisperer, which basically means not inciting a defensive response. Okay, so being aware of what could make that person feel judged or like they have to defend their perspective, and not going there. Keeping that person in the we call it scout mindset, where they're curious, versus soldier mindset, where they're defending themselves. Which is why, as Ali and Katie were saying, it's important not to argue with people. So I also think the task is not so much to be changing the patient as approaching it first to establish a relationship. You'll win based on the quality of your connection, not the quality of your argument and the content that you say. It's the quality of your connection. And so getting at that, I think is helpful. What do you guys think?
And I love that you said the quality of the connection. And that's really, I think that's really what it's all about. And I know I touched on this earlier when we talked about a lot of times folks, especially with religious scrupulosity in the OCD community, saying, I want to see a therapist from my faith tradition. And I have a lot of conversations, even from an educational perspective, on what the role of a therapist is or what the role of a chaplain is. And even in chaplaincy, I always tell folks, my role is never to tell you what's right or what you believe or this is the correct belief. It's to help you figure out the ways that you see your religious text and what's meaningful to you. And I think that as clinicians, you all really get to have those beautiful conversations with folks too, and be open and say, you know what, I might not share your faith background, but I really want to know about your faith background. And I am so committed to helping you figure out what you believe in a meaningful, authentic way. And I'm going to give some tools for that as we get a little bit further. But I also wanted to note just how far deep respect for difference and cultural humility goes with folks. I always think back, this sticks in my mind to this day. So when I worked in interfaith school chaplaincy, this was one of our 6th grade students. I was with them at the museum of, it was teaching tolerance. Tolerance was a part of the title. And I remember her walking up to me, this 11-year-old kid, and she looked at me, and she was one of my Muslim students. And she goes, Chaplain Kay, I don't want anybody to tolerate me. She's like, I want people to understand me. I want people to ask me questions. I want them to appreciate me. I want them to care about me. I don't want anybody to tolerate me. And it always sticks out to me in the work that we do with folks. No one wants a provider to sit in front of them and tolerate trying to understand their truth. It's no, I really might not know all the things, and I want to be there with you. I want to walk with you. I want to see that picture of your pilgrimage to Mecca. And you know what? I might never have been, but I would love to hear about that and see the ways that this integrates with your treatment. And I think that goes a really, really long way. Also want to offer to this group, and I'll put some links for this too. One of the things that I do with Stick with the Ick is we do trainings for clinicians on interfaith literacy for ERP and talk all about Jewish practices and Muslim practices and Hindu practices. So if that's something that you're interested in, I'm more than happy to connect with you on that too, because we don't have to share the same faith to get to offer respect and understanding.
I would say my background is so strange. Being someone that was raised by agnostic Canadians in Boulder, Colorado, that then became a devout evangelical. It gave me a very unique background that I would say these kind of situations come up the most, not necessarily with myself, but with all of my colleagues. I mean, the majority of folks that I work with, and then from Boulder, I worked in Seattle, Portland, Oregon, and people who identify as even, I just didn't have a lot of colleagues that would identify that way or had even any kind of religious background, who are highly skilled. But there's been many times in which I've had a clinician come to me and they're like, "Hey, Allie, I was meeting with this patient. We were talking about this. I know that they're Christian and blah, blah, blah. And I said this, and I don't understand why they're upset." And when I would hear this, I was like, "Oh, yeah, no, that's not gonna go." I can imagine why that didn't go well. And I think that's where, for those clinicians, I absolutely understand why that is intimidating, right? That they have these pure intentions and they're asking these questions that they think that they feel like are out of curiosity. But sometimes the verbiage, I think that's kind of sometimes it just doesn't, it's offensive because of ways that they won't understand unless they've been through, unless they've been in that community. And I think that's where that humility piece is huge, right? Of clinicians who come from a different background, who, you know, or even who do, and maybe they say something that, you know, kind of irks or goes against this person's religious system or what's important to them and their beliefs. That humility piece and being able to go back and do that repair is some of the most important work out there, right? In fact, if we are trying as clinicians to say everything perfectly and never take a misstep, I think that's more concerning because we might not be able to get into the nitty-gritty rather than being able to be the person who, for example, with this patient that I'm thinking of and my colleague, she said something along like the patient was working on exposures related to religious scrupulosity and was like, "Well, I don't understand why, like what's the big deal about," or she didn't say what's the big deal, that's my, you know, like why would it be a big deal to pray less, or like why isn't 3 times a day enough or whatever. And I was like, "Oh no, well, that's not going to go well," or "Why do you have to take notes during church?" Something along those lines. I think being that clinician to be able to go back and do that repair of like, like, you know, I talked to some other folks and that makes sense, right? That I hear that this is so important to you, and that by me saying that, it's almost kind of insinuating that it's not important or that I'm doing something wrong, or that the patient's doing something wrong, or that like this thing shouldn't be important to me, right? Or that the way that I practice my religious practices is, you know, harmful. I think that's the biggest fear, is that people are going to go to a provider and be like, "What you're doing is bad, harmful, you need to change it." And even if that's not what clinicians are saying, that's how it can come across. And so being able to go back and do that repair is huge. And I know for that specific patient clinician, once they had that conversation, it opens up a conversation for the two of them of like the patient being able to say for the first time, like, "This is why this is important to me. This is how I received that information, and why I felt this way." And that clinical relationship just blossomed from there in a way that I don't know if it would have if they wouldn't have come into that snafu, right? I think that sometimes there was this fear of like, "Oh, I know this clinician doesn't get it," right? That conversation made her feel so much more understood and more vulnerable in the work, but also trust her more in the work of like, "Okay, she gets me. She gets like why this is important to me, and she's not going to try to take that away." So I think that's the biggest thing, but I absolutely understand for clinicians why that's intimidating. I think being able to understand as you're going into the work that there very well could be a belief from the patient of like, I have something, I have this knowledge, I have this area of my life that you don't have and that you cannot understand unless you have it as well. Understandable why that is an intimidating concept for the average clinician. And I think that's a great opportunity to be able to practice that, that self-reflection, that clinical humility of like, and with that being said, can I go into this work not trying to prove that like I'm good enough to be trusted, but just that I am here to understand, to listen, to like be you're the expert of you and I want to learn from you in that way. I think that's also where clinicians we can get, when we try to wear too many hats, right? Of like, yes, we should be able to understand every single area of this person's life, their culture, their family structure, their religious practices, that's impossible. And that's where cultural humility comes into play.
And you make up a good point, Ally, because I think so many clinicians maybe avoid talking about religion and culture because understandably we're afraid of really offending people, really hurting people, really upsetting people. And that makes sense. And yet that opportunity to own a mistake, be human, and repair that connection is so powerful.
And it's, gosh, don't be I love, and I know I said this in the chat, but we all mess up. And that's okay. It's being able to own it and have I always think about I have two situations. One was with a Hindu student when I worked in school chaplaincy, who I remember came up to me after an assembly on some interfaith panel and was like, I do not like the way that Hinduism was talked about in this. It missed this, this, and this. And I so appreciated. And she ended up becoming one of the students that I was the closest with and served on my interfaith council just by me being like, okay, like, let me learn from you. And I remember I started building relationships with students so much better when I stood up, even in comparative religion classes, and would say, yeah, I know things about these traditions. Y'all practice this each and every day. And have kids from 6 different traditions kind of in each class. And I would always say, raise your hand, tell me where I'm wrong, tell me what y'all do at home. And I think we build trust with that. I always also think about some of y'all might know Mubina Mirza, anybody in the OCD community. So she's a Muslim OCD therapist and a good friend. And we actually got to be friends from one of the faith and OCD conferences that I was putting on one of the first years, where she emailed me after and was like, okay, there's this part on Islam that was not right. And I was like, great, come on, be a part of the conferences. And I think we get to build relationships from the ways that we respond to our mistakes and are humble about that and are willing to learn.
I'm going to piggyback on what Stacy said, that as counselors, you may be fearful of entering into this. And that takes us to our next question. And y'all already given some illustrations of this, so let's see what else you got. What are your favorite questions to explicitly invite spirituality into the discussion with patients and clients?
You can take it away first, Katie. I know you want to present your FICO model.
Yes, this is okay. So I'll say this first and then turn this back over to Stacy and Ally. But I think so there are spiritual assessment tools that we use as chaplains, and I think that they really apply to clinicians as well in big ways. And I always love saying that, when someone is doing an intake, you can also do really a spiritual assessment as a part of that to see what is important to them about their faith background, and to see how they want that addressed in care. So I'll drop a link here. This is one of the easiest to remember and just kind of simple spiritual assessments to think through when you're doing an intake with a patient, and it's the FICA model. And if you take a look at the link, it kind of walks through 4 different areas. F with FICA is for faith or belief. You're just asking, do you consider yourself religious or spiritual? What brings you meaning? How do you feel connected in that way? I is importance or influence. What influence does it have on how you take care of yourself or on your mental health or your physical health? What role do your beliefs play in your health? How has this been important to you at different points in your life? C, are you a part of a religious community? How has this community supported you? How do you want them to support you as a part of this journey? And A, how would you like me as your provider to address this in your care? How would you like me to talk about your religious and spiritual tradition? What would you like me to learn? What would you like to share with me? And I think even just starting out with that during an initial assessment opens the door for folks to know that you are open to not knowing all of the things and you want to know from them as the expert about their tradition what's the most important to them.
I really like that framework that Reverend Katie presented to us. Some other ones that are favorites of mine is what might God understand about your life that others maybe don't? And James Griffith brings up a quote like learning to listen for reference to spirituality and the spontaneous flow of the clinical dialogue has been the most critical skill for initiating dialogue. Listening, not asking, usually is the greater priority. And so that kind of simplifies it, right? Because I don't think we get a lot of, I didn't get training in my, residency or fellowship in addressing spiritual topics with my patients. So it isn't complicated if we are just willing to go there. And which is an uncomfortable place for us to go.
I think with the majority of the clinical work I've done, having been in higher levels of care, mostly residential, PHP and IOP, a lot of times when folks have gone to me looking for treatment, all these different areas of their life have been greatly influenced, and maybe they've withdrawn from a lot of different areas, or they've lost a lot of those things. So I think faith is always one of those areas of life that I'm asking about. And if it is something that's important to that person, some of the things I'll be curious about is similarly to what we talked about at the beginning, right? For you, how would you define like a life of faith? What does that feel like or look like, right? What are the fruits of the labor? What are some of those things? That me as a clinician, I'm weaving into like, what is that values work going to look like as we're coming up with a treatment plan? Some of the other things I'll ask is, what, according to like maybe your religious community, what would it look like to live a life filled with faith? What does, maybe who is someone of faith that you really respect, that you're like, this is someone that like I admire their life. And also, through the work, a lot of the times what maybe an individual, especially a younger person, considers like a life filled with faith is different than what their community says, right? As far or how they're meeting those needs. What does it look like to serve, right? And how can that be individualized for that person? What does it look like to build community? Does that mean for you going to church weekly or doing a small group, or do you want it to look like something else, right? So I'm always trying to kind of get an idea of what does that look like? What resonates with you? And how can we pull from those things and weave them right into the treatment plan? Let's get you back into life and engage the things that bring you joy. And for a lot of folks, faith is a huge portion of that.
The next question I think is really interesting. Not that any of them prior haven't, but this one is you get to give your opinion really strongly here. Let's pretend you can get all the religious leaders of the world into one Zoom meeting for you to deliver a message to them. What would it be?
I think we're on the same side. Please help. and also, as a religious leader, you have so much potential and value to to be healing in people's lives that I don't have beyond my potential. I wish we could be more collaborative, and because religion is so impactful on people's identity, meaning, purpose, how they handle suffering, how they relate to other human beings. So I guess I would tell them you have great power here to be harnessed for good. And if they could help us be seen as allies in destigmatizing mental health treatment.
Absolutely. I think also, highlighting that, yes, I like my expertise is treating OCD and anxiety and doing these things, and your expertise is something I don't have, right? Like, I need that piece. I'm not going to try to become a makeshift expert religious leader. Some people, I mean, that's a niche that I don't have, and I like that expertise is so valuable, and I want to make sure that people know that not only do I honor that, but like it's so valuable in the clinical work I'm doing, right? That I want to know in your faith system what are the things that are important, what are the rituals that you engage in so that I can make sure that it's honored throughout treatment with this patient, right? I've spent a lot of time talking on the phone to a lot of pastors, priests, and other faith leaders. And I think that's unique to the world of OCD more so maybe than others. But because I think that humility piece, right? If I know what I know, and it only goes so far, and I want to work together to make sure that this person has a life that holistically, is healthy and good and aligns with their values. And I can do my piece, but I need all these other people as well. I think similarly, I think I want to know about what does it look like to engage in the community. Sometimes, many times, especially with youth and young adults, I'll be like, oh, are there opportunities to connect with others or to be more involved? And they'll be like, no, there's nothing. Next thing you know, you call and they're like, oh, well, there's all these opportunities that they could do this and that. And it just, it's great to be able to collaborate with those folks and learn about their community, and resources that maybe I didn't even know were there. So yeah, I think that's the piece that I just continue want to hone in. And I think also recognizing to religious leaders that there has been so much harm done that I absolutely understand why they're weary of mental health providers, some folks, right? That there's this fear, and based on really, a lot of data that mental health professionals might come in and try to say, you know what, I know your faith community says this, but they're wrong. This is damaging. This is fill in the blank. And I'm not, afraid to acknowledge that that harm has been done and that there's repair to be done there. And that's where I'm hoping that we can continue to partner with them and vice versa, so that if there's a situation that comes up, they're like, oh, I feel like we need more support. They're not afraid to reach out to me as the mental health provider, and have maybe and not have these fears of like, oh, well, maybe they think that we're doing this thing wrong, right? That's my hope, is that that stigma and that barrier continues to be taken down over time. And as I develop relationships with different providers or different, I'm so used to using the word providers, different religious leaders within the community around me.
Little statistic I got is, well, 70% of US patients say religion is important to them and they want to discuss it during their therapy. Only like, the majority of psychologists, 80% said they received little to no training in how to address spiritual or religious issues in therapy. So this is an area that I think we can work on.
And ironically, my response, in listening to Stacy and Allie, I would say the same exact thing flipped back from as a religious leader back to mental health providers of, we are so on the same team and we have these different beautiful areas that we know really well. And yes, I know the faith and the interfaith side really well, and y'all know the clinical side really well, and love getting to do interdisciplinary work. Want us to be able to rely on each other and support people in living big, beautiful, awesome, value-driven lives. And we really can do that together in the different roles that we have, and collaborate. Interdisciplinary collaboration on cases is my life and my work. And I love the amazing clinicians that I get to work with, and I love sharing that. But also, just like Allie said, I also always want mental health professionals to know that I also so get why they're weary of faith leaders and that there has been so much hurt and that religious trauma, spiritual abuse, adverse religious experiences, those things are real. And we can be faith leaders and acknowledge that those things are very real and also recognize that there have been so many issues and that we can acknowledge that and be a part of the solution. So I think I want that always. Yeah, as I'm talking to mental health professionals, them to hear from me, we are in this together. I'm sorry. And also, let's do this work together and help people to live really beautiful, healthy lives.
I'm going to move us to our last question to try to give us space for some discussion.
I don't know if Katie got to fully answer the question.
Oh,
that one.
Were you done?
What do you with, well, I don't know, feedback, what do you with medical and mental health professionals did differently though to help religious and spiritual patients feel safer?
Yeah, I mean, so what I'll say, and John, I promise I'll say it quickly. If
Okay.
folks are interested, you can reach out to me for resources after, because this is a lot of what the areas I did research on. I really wish sometimes that medical professionals and mental health professionals actually recognize, and I think a lot of this is just like we talked about in education, we don't necessarily learn these things, right? But recognize the really significant research-based roles of chaplains and of spiritual care providers, not necessarily just through a religious lens or for religious scrupulosity cases or for someone who is going through a spiritual crisis, but actually because from a research perspective, faith is a significant value in the midst of treatment. And from a research perspective, faith actually is something that can really assist someone with their healing as they're navigating mental health treatment. So I'd like it to be seen, I don't know, as more of an asset. And we have this conversation. My program that I just finished was the doctoral program was all chaplains who work in lots of different facets. And we all had the same conversation around chaplaincy is such a beautiful thing. And a lot of clinicians don't necessarily know what that is. And I so get that because it hasn't always been taught. But I would like education to happen around the fact that we can do this interdisciplinary work together. And again, it's not just about this person needs communion or this person needs this. It's really about evidence-based ways to be a part of this interdisciplinary care team that can make a difference for someone's health and their life.
Thank you. And this last question, actually, y'all already sort of hinted at some answers. So let's just see if you want to add more or circle back. But the last question is, tell us about a mistake you made while discussing religion and spirituality with a patient and client, and what did you learn?
I go first. Okay, I remember I had a couple Jewish patients. They were conservative, and I wanted to be like, oh look, I can talk Jewish, so I can be accepted and look cool. I can do it. Like, look at me, and it didn't work out. Obviously. It doesn't work out. Trying to look at me, I'm in an in-group, and trying to signal that and yeah, and I offended them. And so I think that I wasn't showing up as vulnerably and authentically as I should have been in that scenario. Yeah. What about you guys?
Thank you, Stacy, for sharing that. And I always think it's so important for us to share those moments when we don't get it right and to continue to step forward. And I'll name this one I shared as we were preparing for this. I actually have not shared this in a presentation ever. So I'm kind of like, oh, this makes me nervous, which is why we have these conversations. But probably my biggest screw up in chaplaincy was when I first shifted from school chaplaincy to work around scrupulosity and faith and OCD. And I was referred as a chaplain on a case with a young person who was from a very conservative religious background, and they came out to me as gay, and I immediately affirmed them for being a part of the LGBTQIA community, told them that they were loved and that they were enough. And they came from a tradition that didn't affirm that. And they were so angry at me for affirming them immediately that they refused to see me and actually wouldn't see me for 6 months. They dropped off from treatment. Now they ended up coming back and they're doing really well and are actually out and thriving in their community. But at the time, I realized that as much as that is a part of my belief, and I will always want to affirm young people for their sexual orientation and their gender identity, that isn't where that person was with their beliefs right now. And what they wanted me to do wasn't to say something from my belief, but just to be there and to listen to where they were and the fears that they had about that. And it really impacted the trust in our relationship and has really impacted the way that I respond to these things moving forward, where again, I always want to affirm, but I want to do it in a way that's comfortable for that person and where they're coming from.
Kind of alluded to one of my examples earlier of like where filling in the gaps, right? Getting some initial information and just being like, oh, so therefore, based on this, it must mean X, Y, and Z. So I had a patient that was a young adult who came from an Orthodox Jewish background. And during their treatment, they were describing to me like rules within the religious practice and, oh, this is what you do, this is what you don't do when it comes to dating and relationships. This is, how it goes. And so I kind of just, with getting that information, I took that and I made that like how I was thinking about their treatment plan too. It was weeks later that I think I was talking to another clinician actually, and they're like, "Oh yeah, so and so wants to download Tinder." And I was like, "What?" Like I just assumed that because they said this is what my religious practice is, this is what the community does, that meant to them, therefore that's what they wanted for themselves. That was a rule for themselves. And I didn't quite like I didn't ask more, right? And I think sometimes actually that's where clinicians get the most stuck is that they are so concerned about taking a misstep and offending and maybe implying that maybe they should live a little bit more outside that realm, that they won't ask certain questions that are so important, right? It could have been easy that information wouldn't have come up and we would have just missed this whole piece of their life of like, no, they want to get out there and date and do these things in this way, even though it doesn't align with what they've been taught or maybe their background. And that was just like this piece to me of like, oh my goodness, I didn't even think twice about asking more or asking about this because I didn't want to offend or push, right? And I think that's where actually I see that come up more and more again. Similarly, I had another case in which I was working with a patient and their family, and I was working with the patient individually. And she was explaining to me again religious practices and some of the work we were doing, the guide or kind of what she considered the rules that would be against her religious practices. And she would say to me, oh, no, like if I did that, my parents would not be okay. They would not approve of that. That would be a big problem. And I went with that. And then I went and we kind of based it off of, oh, yeah, your parents' approval is really important to you. Just for later on for me to eventually meet the parents and then be like, oh, no, like we're totally fine with that. That's not a problem at all. We encourage her to do these things. It almost reminds me of like kids who are really academically like high performers academically, and they're like, "Oh, if I got a B, my parent would be so mad." And then you meet the parent, they're like, "I would be fine if they got straight C's." So again, I think just like assuming sometimes when I get more restrictive or maybe more conservative side information, like, "Oh yes, I cannot." Explore anymore because I don't want to disrespect them, sometimes can prevent you from getting information about like what this person wants, maybe what they want to do differently with their life. And that being curious with that and asking questions actually sometimes is something we'll veer away from as clinicians. So those are two cases that come to mind when I think about where I was like, oh, I kind of missed a piece there. I wish I would have asked more looking back.
And interestingly, I've had some cases where, a patient will say, oh, well, my religious faith leader will say such and such. And I had a conversation with that religious faith leader, and what they had to say was very, very different. Interestingly. So that can be really informative.
Katie, did you have something else to add?
Oh, I was just gonna say thank you to Allie for sharing that too, both to Stacy and Allie, because I think, it's tough to share missteps, and I think it normalizes and also helps us all to do the brave thing by doing this work and being, willing to admit when we screw up and also keep stepping forward to make a difference for people. So thank y'all.
Let's go ahead and take any questions that anyone may have. Let's start on the screen. Anyone, and as you have questions, you just use the hand to raise the emoji or reaction to raise your hand. Anyone have a question that they would like to pose off of the virtual world?
We have
I
someone.
wanted to say,
Go ahead.
when you were speaking earlier, you mentioned like the vulnerability piece of being a clinician.
Yes.
It really struck a chord with me
Mhm.
because I feel there's so much value in me being vulnerable in the process and saying like, hey, I messed up. I'm human too. We're two human beings
Yeah.
here. And as invested as you are in the process, I'm also invested. And you being well is part of my investment.
Yeah.
And so maybe I got a little overzealous by
Right.
jumping to that conclusion.
Yeah.
But can we work through that? And then I explain how that's modeling conflict resolution
Mm-hmm.
and say like, this is how life works. You know?
Sorry, can't talk right now. Modeling self-acceptance of our humanness. What's your work been like with religious populations? And you mentioned religious leaders.
Yeah. So I'm actually a religious faculty minister.
Cool, you're a minister.
Yeah.
Oh,
So,
sorry. I think it's cool to have another minister here. Isn't that cool, Reverend Katie?
Well, it's interesting because sometimes I get flack for working with everyone.
Working with everyone, huh? How's
Like
that work?
I feel like too many people care about what other people are doing. Like I
Okay.
almost don't care that somebody else is like a LGBTQ member or whatever. Like I
Mhm.
don't like that doesn't take a factor in whether or not I'm
Yeah.
gonna take you on as a client.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway,
That's hard. So there's judgment on you
yeah,
regarding who you accept as client.
yeah.
And
how
that's
are
what a
you-
lot of our religious populations fear,
Yeah.
right? Being outed from the tribe.
And it doesn't help. It doesn't help them to feel okay in their own body.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't help the ecclesia
Mm-hmm.
to feel like someone doesn't think like I think, someone doesn't live how I live. That's okay too. Because it's not really our position to tell people cast dispersion. Right? So that's been an interesting dynamic. But mostly when I'm with fivefold ministers, a lot of them feel highly that we should be just praying about issues and about concerns. And that's how we mentally manage. But I often just say like, well, the word of God tells us to seek wise counsel. In whatever we do, we should seek wisdom and get understanding. So if we're really pursuing understanding of like our relationship with God, that means that we're always discovering more about who he is and more about who we are.
An ongoing process of discovery.
It is.
Yeah.
So it's necessary. You can't just pray deep-seated issues. And I feel that sometimes that's where like church hurt and church trauma comes to play. But I also sit with pastors and their families. Family therapy with pastors.
Yeah.
Is interesting.
Hard. Thank you. Because that's such a ripple effect.
Yeah.
When you can have healing there on a community.
And they're rigid in their thinking, a lot of them, about like what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah.
And it's
And
like,
there isn't space for that humility and curiosity that I'm like, okay, you're an expert on that?
yeah, and why, I don't get why my kids just hate me. Well, they're 30 years old and you still don't accept them for who they say
Yeah.
they are. You know, you might have a problem there, but it's still good that we have pastors willing to do that.
No, I was just gonna say I love that you brought that up, and I think you creating those spaces also for them is so incredibly important. And I'll name I have run some different groups now for clergy with OCD and with scrupulosity, and I always find it really fascinating that I always have folks in those groups who are not open to their congregation about the fact that they're seeking mental health treatment and who are really, really rigid in their thinking with everybody else kind of in that congregation, but are working through their own journey. And I always find it really, really fascinating and try to create spaces for that and also try to plant seeds that they may at some point be able to share within their communities. And what does it look like, you know, as they're working on their own journey of theological flexibility and OCD treatment for that to carry over into some of what they're preaching. Is that a possibility? So I think I just to name, I so am with you and get you, and I'm so thankful for the work that you do also.
To be that ripple effect, right? Isn't that what Yalom talks about?
Yeah,
that
okay,
ripple.
I'm rereading The Gift of Therapy right now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good stuff. Good
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
You know, and then when I offer, you know, like a family comes in, okay, we're here, so that, you know, they can get counseling to no longer be gay, for example. Approaching that and saying, you know, with what is your perspective on that? And then I'm offering the medical perspective. That's one perspective, right? Medical sciences perspective is blank. And my job here as a consultant is to offer that perspective while also being curious about your perspective too, as opposed to offering, you know, we can do that too as medical professionals. Be like, well, the right thing is blank, and you know, not to end there, not to.
I'm always trying to give myself permission to learn more. Like even in the moment, I'm like, okay, I can learn from this. I mean, I have 2 teenagers, so always learning more. But maybe I don't want to learn from them, but you know, we do. We should. So if
What do
we
you
can live that
What do you want to
way.
see people talking about more?
I really feel a heart for church hurt, church wounds, and wounded leaders.
Isn't that our last topic? Okay.
Because
Yeah.
wounded leaders,
Yeah, wounded leaders. Yes, yes.
So when I sit with these pastors and I hear all the wounds they have, then I think about my own religious upbringing,
Mm-hmm.
some of the things some of the mismanagement of scripture because of the pastor speaking from their own traumatic lens, misinterpreting it. I hear a lot of people having that same struggle, that same concern. So I would love people leading other people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
We had a hand up on the screen. Nikki, you have a question?
Yeah, and I feel like this is going to tie right into kind of some of those like misconceptions. As someone is still learning about like spiritually integrated therapy, even the conversation kind of touched on a little bit of like the role of a chaplain in working with clients. How, as a provider or talking to other providers or even talking to clients, like how do I kind of explain the role of a chaplain? Because I don't want to say, I mean, from what I'm learning is that the rigid lines of like religion and spiritualness is really starting to come down, and that mental health is now being more talked about in religious communities. But that's not common knowledge. And I'm slowly learning more about how those rigid lines are falling. So how do I incorporate bringing up the role of a chaplain or without like overstepping?
Yeah. And are you, can you tell me more about the setting that you're in? Are you in a space that's connected to chaplains or is it private? What does that look like?
No, the reason I bring that up is because it's one of the questions actually was like one, and it's not happened, but just because I'm open to talking about people's spiritual views, but that's just personal. But I think one of the mistakes that I see some providers making is not talking about someone's spiritual or religious views. Or when someone brings up, like, I'm just following the path that, God has laid out for me, and then they just keep going into the clinical aspect of a session. And I think it's such a missed opportunity to really incorporate that into the session. But say, I want to have them more involved in the community. Like, I don't know how to give that information, like, hey, like for example, I'm guessing like these chaplains, at the church, you can go and talk to them also and find ways to like get involved in the community more or have like other spiritual resources. But I don't want to give that information and then them go in and then like have somebody like just preaching gospel to them or being like over the top and they're like, whoa, I'm like comfortable with like God, but I'm not like religious. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, and to clarify the chaplain piece too, which might be helpful, there aren't typically chaplains within churches or congregations. So how I always define the role of a chaplain for folks is it's an ordained minister or clergy person who is specifically trained to do work outside of a typically religious space. So often there's chaplains that are tied to hospitals or to mental health settings or to schools. And it's really interesting a lot. It's not actually common knowledge at all that chaplains are typically actually trained in mental health care. So we're trained in how to work alongside clinicians and how to take clinical notes for clinicians to read and kind of work within healthcare systems. So what I always tell folks with that, there's kind of two different avenues if you think someone would be helpful to spiritually support on the case. If there are spiritual leaders in your area that you feel comfortable with or that are a part of their community, you can always ask, hey, do you think someone offering spiritual care could be an important part of this journey? And you could connect them with someone, you could have them sign an ROI, and you actually could work directly alongside that spiritual leader. And then if you're specifically interested in working with a chaplain or having them talk to a chaplain, I always tell folks, please feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to plug you in with someone or try to kind of connect you in that area. But I think the initial part of the conversation is it, and I don't ever feel like this is pushy. It's just educational. It's like, oh, this sounds like it's really important to you. Do you feel like you would like to have somebody as a part of the spiritual side of your care team? And letting them know that that never means that they can't have those conversations with you, but that there's really cool opportunities for interdisciplinary work. So most of the cases I work on, we have kind of a whole ROI process. And even if it's remote, we communicate every day, and every time I have a spiritual care session, I'll connect with the clinician and vice versa. So I think there's cool opportunities for that. And I'm so glad you asked, Nikki, because a lot of folks don't know that that actually exists. Yeah.
I didn't even know that chaplains go to schools. I work with a lot of kids. So sometimes they don't feel comfortable like talking to the guidance counselor. So even having like a discussion of like, would you be interested in maybe meeting with the chaplain? I'm trying to arrange that as like an additional resource that provides mental health services. I didn't even know that was a thing.
And with schools, it can be different. I was so a lot of times there'll be chaplains who specifically work for a hospital system. A lot of times that's really prevalent in the VA or in mental health systems or in the military. And then with schools, it can be, hit or miss. A lot of times private schools have chaplains that aren't from a specific faith tradition, but that kind of support students across the board. And I was very fortunate that I was at a school that continued to fund that. It used to be a military academy and then was no longer. And it was actually a really cool space, the most diverse private school in Georgia. So we had kids from all different faith backgrounds, and that was really significant to them. And they found it to be really important for people to get to walk with them through grief and trauma and loss in ways that honored their religious lens. But yeah, if you're ever working in spaces where there aren't chaplains and you want to connect with someone who's trained in that area, please reach out and we'll chat.
Okay. Yeah, I might reach out anyways just to get more information on it because I'm sure, especially with some of the kids that I'm working with, if they're interested, would really benefit from having just that extra resource.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nikki.
I think about one specific case also with that concept, but it comes up over and over again. I'm having a lot of conversations with patients, whether they're adults or children, also about, going into conversations with additional supports, like setting expectations and kind of indicators of, is this a helpful and healthy conversation or not? I look back at my own experience being, 15 years old and working with a youth group leader who very quickly shifted into a makeshift therapist, psychologist, family therapist, and how problematic that was on so many different, and it was because I didn't have, not that that was my responsibility by any means, but I didn't have clear expectations of what support they could versus couldn't offer, what was healthy support, what those boundaries were. And so that's the conversation I'm having all the time with youth as well. Of like, great, yes, I want you to be involved in this. What would that look like for you, for that to be a helpful support, right? And especially working with kids who have anxiety disorders and OCD, who tend to veer on the side of the spectrum of, this person said I need to do this, and so I'm doing it, is usually the takeaway. That's something I'm always talking through. But I'm thinking about one specific case of a patient who I had, who was a man who was in an intensive treatment program for OCD, and he had religious scrupulosity, so engaging in compulsive prayer and other types of religious practices. And so a lot of the conversations that we had was he had been avoiding the church at all costs. It was too triggering, right? Because he was just going to be like stuck in compulsions for hours, if not days. So a lot of those conversations was, yeah, you want to meet with the priest from your church. Great. Absolutely. I support you in that. Let's talk through when you meet with this person, right? What are the things you want to talk about? If he says something like, you should be praying this amount in this way, how can you take that information and not, have OCD take it and twist it, right? Where are things going to get sticky for you? And also, how can you go into this conversation kind of having an idea of what support you're looking for? Let's make that clear. Like maybe you're looking for, oh, I'd love guidance around, these areas of faith or how to connect with the community. There are these different areas. And where might your anxiety and OCD maybe twist something, or where could it get sticky boundary wise? And let's talk through that ahead of time so that you don't come out of it being like, oh my goodness, did I do something wrong? Or maybe, taking those things and being like, and therefore I need to do this, which tends to be the route that OCD people take. So a lot of coaching kind of play, talking through what is the support you're looking for? Where could those boundaries get blurry in any relationship, right? So that people have a good idea rather than just being like, yeah, go, connect with this person if they're the type of patient that's going to be vulnerable to maybe, having those boundaries be blurry or taking something and having it be unhelpful for them, if that makes sense.
A really good point, Allie. Thank you. Did people have feedback on what topics they want us to cover or things maybe we didn't talk about? Or
I will share on the screen the flyer for our upcoming our other 3 presentations. That might be
Is there a place people could like email to get notifications?
Well, I have everyone's email from the
For this,
registration.
okay, cool. So we can just send out an email.
Yes, so on the screen, you see the outline or the flyer that lists the other 3 presentations. February 13th, the potential of healing and harm. And on March 27th, sexuality and gender. There's a different word we wanted to use there. Sexuality and gender, I wonder what it is.
Sexuality and gender.
There we go. Boom. And then finally, for April, religious trauma and deconstruction, and that's what we're trying to think about earlier.
Yes.
Yeah,
What was it?
religious
Oh,
trauma and
yeah.
deconstruction.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, I have all of your emails from when you registered, and oh, Allie says there's 2 questions on the sheet as well. Okay. Can you want to go ahead and read those, Allie? I'm not looking at that.
And the video will be up too. If you want to put the website in there, I can put my YouTube channel in there.
Okay, question 1. How have you handled when clients, parents, or family members think you're going to, quote, convert them to a certain religion, to not get divorced or an
Yep.
abortion, or to be straight because you share the parents' religion but not all beliefs?
Yeah. And
Yeah,
I think
it doesn't work.
yeah, I mean, I think validating that fear, right? That's scary, like understanding what that would mean to the parent was very important. Do you have thoughts, Katie and Allie?
It's funny, what comes up for me more was when I was working with students and teaching comparative religions. By the time I was there, I taught like 1,500 kids in comparative religions. And I would say probably 5% of those families at some point came up to me and were like, are you trying to convert my child to a different religion? Because you're teaching them about other stuff. And I think what really helped with that, I ended up having awesome conversations in terms of saying, no, I'm here to show up and help them believe what it is that's the most significant to them, and also learn about the world and the way that they fit into the world. So I think similar to what Stacy is saying, being able to validate and to say, oh gosh, I understand why that is so scary. And this also really has nothing to do with what I believe. It's about me showing up for your family and for your child and helping them navigate in the way that's the healthiest and most authentic to them.
And that your identity, whatever that is, I say your only job as a patient is to be honest. And I'm here, right? No, that's it. Show up as your honest, authentic self, and I accept whatever that is, whatever that.
I want to go ahead to the other question that was put in the form. What are some ways that clinicians can practice self-care when a client's faith triggers their own OCD fears?
Interesting. That could be the question for Allie.
I wanted some of those not M&Ms. But you know the way I was gonna go back to that.
Not to get back to Orlando.
Peanut, you are welcome. I'm gonna make it.
No, for Allie, did you hear the question?
Yeah. Well, with my OCD content, it doesn't happen to be overlap almost at all with religious types of themes, but just in general, I think that is one of the beautiful things about being a practitioner, a provider who treats OCD and has lived experience myself, is that as I'm doing this work with patients all the time, I mean, my OCD is a lifelong experience, and I've had other providers ask me, oh, when was the last time you had an intrusive thought? And my response is usually like, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes ago. And that's where, like, with doing the work and having experiences that bring on my OCD or make it stronger, doing clinical work is such a value to me, that when those instances happen, it's like, and I continue to lean into the anxiety and do the work myself because this is so important to me, right? Are different exposures also can be challenging for myself? Yes. And that's exactly where, as I'm working with patients, I can be like, and let's go back to values, right? That's why I'm a clinician. That's why I do this work, even though it's not always easy, and continue to do my own OCD work. But also, like, I think it brings on this, like, I'm in this with you, type of mentality. So as far as self-care goes, I think that's also making sure that I'm engaging in the treatment and the supports that I need so that I'm able to show up fully and authentically in the clinical work I'm doing, and not just white knuckling, being like, oh, I can't wait till this is over. Also because your OCD patients will be able to sense that themselves. So doing the work is part of the deal of being a provider in this field.
One of the best experiences that I had that was first embarrassing, but it turned out to be a really good experience, was one day I received a phone call from a woman. I don't know what I posted online or something, but she messaged me and was like, hey, I have a podcast talking about therapists with OCD. You want to do a podcast? And I was like, mind your business. But But after a while, I thought about it because I had a really strong bout when I was graduating. Like, who's sending me out in the world to help people? What? It's crazy. No, thank you. I shouldn't be doing this. I don't have any clue. And of course, I didn't, right? But anyways, I ended up doing the podcast. And years later, a client of mine found that podcast episode, and I was like, oh my gosh.
Mhm.
And she was like, I haven't told you this, but I have OCD. And I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, and that probably made her feel really connected.
Yeah. She's like, now I feel like I can tell you everything.
Yeah,
And I was like, wow, while it was embarrassing for her to discover that initially,
yeah,
and the courage it took for me to do the interview, because it was like rip the band-aid off and just say the thing. But ultimately it ended up being rewarding because she saw herself as someone, saw me more relatable clinically and professionally as a person, as being a being.
and that there's shared humanity.
Mhm.
People connect to us, not based on how successful we are or our triumphs. People connect to us
Mhm.
through our flaws.
Mhm. So true. Yeah.
So we're gonna land the plane.
Okay. Do you want to tell people how they find the video later? Because it's gonna be on my channel and the Samaritan channel.
It'll be on the-
Share it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It'll be on the Samaritan YouTube channel, when I get that done. And
No problem.
then I'll send the link out, I have all of your email address, I'll send that out to you once I have that done. Just a reminder, of course, those of you on the screen, of course, those in the room as well, I have hard copies of the CEU evaluation if you want to take that with you, or you can fill it out online using the link, which I will send to you. Again, you already have it, but I'll resend it to you as well. All right.
Can I
Thank you.
answer the scrupulosity question in like 45 seconds that somebody
No.
posted? Okay.
No.
So, and just to offer where to thank you, Allie knows I'll like implode if we don't get to answer that because this is like everything I love. Yeah, she's like, yes, she will. So religious scrupulosity, I know we've thrown this word around today, but if folks aren't familiar with that, that is really a facet of OCD where obsessions and compulsions relate to someone's religious practices and experiences. And I always say that OCD comes in all different really gross artificial flavors based on what is the most important to someone, but it's all just different gross flavors of the same nasty OCD ice cream. And one of those flavors is religious scrupulosity. And this can present in so many different ways based on what's the most important to someone, where they start asking questions and what ifs and having intrusive thoughts and obsessions about what if they're not faithful enough? What if they didn't pray effectively? What if they didn't engage in dietary restrictions appropriately or ritually wash appropriately? You could see how this could go across so many different traditions, but it goes beyond what's normative for that particular faith tradition or sect or denomination. And it's no longer about actually connecting with God, but really about alleviating the discomfort that's coming from the disorder. So they spend so much time ritualizing and doing compulsions that to an untrained eye or to many faith leaders could look like that person is just really, really devout, when the reality is that they're continuing to feed the disorder. So exposure and response prevention as under the umbrella of cognitive behavioral therapy is seen as the gold standard treatment for that and is incredibly effective in helping people reconnect with their faith traditions. And if folks want more information on this, I talk about this all day, every day. I know I shared some information earlier, but happy to help and also talk about what this might look like across different traditions. Because I think especially in the development of exposures for clinicians, we want to make sure that we are making folks uncomfortable, but never crossing lines that aren't respectful of someone's individual traditions. And I think this is where I love, as a chaplain and religious leader, kind of helping folks figure out, what does that look like? How can we lean into cultural humility? How can we ask questions and help someone get better but also honor their tradition? So thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
All right, everyone.
Thank you everyone for coming together.
Appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you in our next presentation on February 13th.